Howie Roseman has the Philadelphia Eagles roster down to 53 players. Initially, the roster is set heading into Brazil. Our takeaways coming up next right here on the Locked On Eagles podcast.
You are Locked On Eagles, your daily Philadelphia Eagles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's going on, Eagles fans? Thanks so much for making Locked On Eagles your first listen each and every day. I'm one of your two co-hosts, Louie DiBiase, joined as always by Gino Camilleri. We're brought to you by FanDuel. Now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. Howie Roseman was busy at work today. The Eagles roster is down from 90 players to 53. Gino, all of our takeaways today. Just want to say the roster seems set, but a lot of players got released and waived across the NFL. There will be trades tossed around the NFL as well. I think there's still movement to come 100%, but I will say I don't think you're going to see a lot of dramatic changes to this 53. I do like what they have on paper on both sides of the ball. And I'm happy that a lot of the tough decisions, the outcome that we got was what I preferred.
I think we went about 95% in our predictions.
Yeah, we kind of crushed these predictions for sure.
The only one I believe that we missed on was Dylan McMahon.
McMahon getting waived, which was surprising, Gino, because he was like your most traditional center backup, a draft pick that I thought had a great preseason. They probably want to stash him on the practice squad.
And then James Bradberry making this team. And I think we should just start there because it's been the biggest elephant in the room. What is going to happen with James Bradberry? The good thing about this, though, it doesn't come at the extent of having to lose some of these younger players.
Like Tristan McCullum. He made the roster.
McCullum makes the team. Thomas Booker makes the team. Patrick Johnson. Ben Van Sumeren makes the team. James Bradberry, and you and I briefly touched on this, the best route forward right now, more than likely, is him being on the team, the Eagles paying some of this money over the course of the year, and come week 6, come week 7, or let's say when Sidney Brown comes off of the PUP, James Bradberry is going to get traded to potentially somebody who has an injury at this position. Maybe the Eagles suffer an injury at this position, and he is going to be that guy who's either a depth piece in Philly or a depth piece somewhere else, because come that time when Sidney Brown does come off the PUP, if James Bradberry is going to stay on the roster and then you end up cutting one of those young guys that you were able to keep right now, that would be a shame. But even tomorrow, you might be making a decision on this because you could potentially add talent at wide receiver and get a depth player there or tight end, or maybe you like another offensive lineman. Who's going to be the guy you cut tomorrow, Lou? Because it's not James Bradberry. If they were going to do it, they would have already done it today. It's not going to be him. He's in Philadelphia.
And look, I understand some of the logic. Right now with Sidney Brown on the PUP, you didn't have to lose Tristan McCullum or Thomas Booker or BVS or Patrick Johnson. You could have Bradberry on the roster. You're paying him anyway. You have a bunch of young corners. Maybe you think maybe this doesn't work out. Doomsday scenario. We need James Bradberry in a win now season at safety or at corner. Like, I kind of understand that part of it. But to me, like you're saying, this is only a short-term thing. Sidney Brown will be back in 4 games. They only kept 2 tight ends and 5 receivers because that's what's justified on this current roster. But you look at guys that got released across the league, like Noah Brown, who we thought the Eagles could trade a pick for from the Houston Texans. Terrace Marshall Jr. from the Carolina Panthers, a former second-round pick. Heck, even a Kadarius Toney. I'm not in on that, but maybe Kellen Moore is in a pre-snap motion offense. Maybe he wants a fast guy like Kadarius Toney, or Justin Ross got released today by the Chiefs as well. So overall, eventually you're going to have to cut somebody else. They're going to either make a move at one of those spots or a trade, or Sidney Brown's going to come back. And for me, just because James Bradberry had success years ago at a completely different position does not warrant a spot over one of these younger players. Experience doesn't always mean better. Sometimes the experience was bad. It's why I say Tanner McKee should be the guy at QB2 over Kenny Pickett. I like the young, more talented pieces that are on this roster. And for now, I'm fine with Bradberry being on this team, but I hope eventually, like you're saying, they're hoping that a roster spot opens up from an injury with another team and they need a Bradberry. They can flip him for a draft pick. and then you move forward with the young guys. So we'll watch how it goes. But yeah, I hope he's not on this roster long term.
The thing you have to do, and I think Howie Roseman is continuing to realize this, is get the guys in the building that are going to produce in the future. It's not what have you done for me in the past. It's what have you done for me lately, though.
And it's not like he was okay last year. Like, yes, he was an all-pro 2 years ago, but things in the NFL change very fast, especially for a slower corner. And last year, it wasn't just like he was okay. He took like a Darius Slay step back. Like Slay last year wasn't better than 2022, but he was still good enough where you want him starting. Bradberry last year was egregiously bad. That it's a huge difference.
The good thing is you kept Eli Ricks. You kept these young players. But Howie Roseman is understanding. You look at that Hassan Reddick move. We have to pay the guys for the future, especially these cost-controlled type of players. We have to keep them here because these veterans who might be here for a year or two, you don't have them for more than a year or two. It's just that. Even James Bradberry, he's only here on a 3-year contract. This is year 2, and you had the out after this season.
Correct.
He's not going to be here more than 6 more calendar months, more than likely. But what is the potential future ceiling of Tristan McCollum? And what is the future potential ceiling on an Eli Ricks? It's way higher than James Bradberry, somebody who's over the hill right now. But now we're not talking about a James Bradberry who's going to have to play cornerback 2 for you or be your third safety. We're talking about a guy who's probably not going to dress at all. But Howie Roseman, he did a good job, him and his staff, earlier in this offseason, prioritizing players that were on other teams' practice squads. And he brings in a guy in Thomas Booker, who just a couple of weeks ago wasn't even on the radar for a lot of people to make his way at a position that is really stacked, fought his way onto the roster. Patrick Johnson, who Jalix Hunt comes around, and Nolan Smith has a big role established for him moving forward. He comes in and he looks the part. He looks just as good as the rest of them. And Ben Van Sumeren in a linebacker group, Lou, where the rest of the guys have performed pretty well in this preseason. He might be the best guy you have in terms of coverage.
Yeah.
And all these guys are young players that you brought in with your coaching staff in hopes to develop. Hats off to the position coaches. Hats off to the personnel department. The young guys that they were able to keep and not put on the waiver wire. It's a great example of development, and it's a great example of the personnel department understanding where they were weak. Howie Roseman said last year was his responsibility in terms of the defensive backfield and lack of depth. He had to go out there, and they kept 11, rightfully so. Those guys deserve roster spots.
And, like I was saying, you don't just keep a guy for the sake of experience, but you also don't just keep players because they're young or because you drafted them. But these young guys, they all earned a spot. Like Thomas Booker, Moro Ijoma, Marlon Tuipulotu, they looked great this summer. Tristan McCullum, I'm a huge fan of. I went back and watched that tape from Saturday this morning, and I'm over the moon with him being on the 53. Like the length, the range, the speed, the tackling that guy's got, like he earned a spot on this roster. All of your draft picks this year, outside of Anais Smith, who of course got the phantom IR today with that quote-unquote ankle injury, so he'll be stashed away.
And Dylan McMahon as well.
And Dylan McMahon, yep. Outside of those two, and by the way, McMahon did look good in the preseason, outside of Smith specifically, all of your rookie class played really well and flashed, and I think a lot of your second and third-year players did too. So these young players, they didn't just say we're going to keep these guys and see through the investment, but they're also starting to slowly see a return on that investment.
And the only way that you can do that is to see if they can actually play, and that's to keep them on the roster. And you at least have to keep them in the building. That was the mistake of the rosters that really give us the trauma around this time of year, 2018, 2019, where you're saying, why are we justifying keeping some of these older players when we have young guys that are in the building that might warrant keeping a spot over? But hey, we invested in that guy. We're going to keep him because we drafted him. Howie Roseman, he's learning to throw his ego out. It doesn't matter where the guy got drafted. Zach McPherson, if you don't look the part, we're going to cut you. That's how it has to be in the National Football League.
I think outside of Bradberry, this roster looks pretty justified. There isn't a pick that I'm like...
Without a doubt, man.
In the depth chart might be different. I'll feel a certain way about like Kenny Pickett being ahead of Tanner McKee, but the guys they kept, I feel like everybody did deserve to be on this football team. There's not anybody outside of James that I'm like, I just don't think he should be on the 53. But I would say those are the two bigger, I don't want to say shocking moves, but James Bradberry being on the 53, Dylan McMahon not being on the team. Those are, I think, the two biggest surprises because, you look at the offensive line, they've kept, and we'll do a bigger roster breakdown in segment 2, but looking at the offensive line, they only kept 9, and none of them are really a traditional center if Cam Jurgens goes down because Matt Hennessy was not kept. Neither was Brett Toth, who was playing there a lot this summer behind Jurgens, and then, of course, Dylan McMahon. So unless you move Landon Dickerson to center and then Steen kicks over to left guard, you're going to have to find some center backup at some point if something happens to Cam.
That's potentially one of those positions where you're looking at around the NFL. Hey, did a team release a true center that might give us some upside there?
Sure.
Where Dylan McMahon, he's just a rookie. He's going to be fine developing over the next couple of years. Brett Toth he's a good guy to have on your practice squad, but you can't go into the season with only one guy who can snap the football.
I agree.
Because you can't be in the situation where you move, let's say Landon Dickerson is the next guy up. Are you going to move him and then potentially bring somebody else in at left guard?
Well, Stoutland doesn't normally like to move multiple people.
He hates doing that. He said it for the last decade.
Yeah, and I normally am okay with that, but that's not a Stoutland thing. So I am curious to see what their mindset is at center, but we'll continue to follow it. Again, this initial 53 is set, but moves are definitely to come for Howie Roseman. What moves could be happening? We'll continue to break down Roseman's decisions on Tuesday, coming up next right here on the Locked On Eagles podcast. Today's episode of the Locked On Eagles podcast is brought to you by FanDuel. We all have something a little bit different for you through September 22nd at FanDuel. All customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Then with a YouTube TV base plan, you'll be able to watch every regular season Sunday afternoon out-of-market game. Gino and I both need that for the Eagles. He's in Colorado. I'm in New York. All you need is a Google account and a current form of payment, and you can cancel anytime. So once again, you're going to get a $5 bet. It's going to get you a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Just visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to download America's #1 sportsbook. Thanks so much for making Locked On Eagles your first listen each and every day. Guys, make sure your second listen is the Locked On Fantasy Football Podcast. Get daily insight to the best fantasy draft strategies so you can win your league this season. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. The Eagles' initial 53-man roster is set. Gino, again, not a lot of surprises. They kept James Bradberry, not Dylan McMahon. Two somewhat surprising moves, but overall, they kept exactly who we thought. 3 quarterbacks, 3 running backs, Hurts, McKee, Pickett, Saquon, Gainwell, Shipley. No surprises there. You nailed the receiver thing. We were debating like Paris Campbell versus Aniyah Smith. Well, Smith gets stashed on the IR. Paris Campbell did get released today. They're only carrying 5 right now. It's A.J. Brown, Devontae Smith, Jahan Dotson, Johnny Wilson, Britton Covey. But that could change. I do think there's some receivers out there that are very interesting and that make more sense than Paris Campbell right now. So things are ever evolving.
I think we got to give ourselves a quick pat on the back, not being inside the NovaCare complex each and every week, each and every practice, and we only missed 1 guy on this entire roster.
I got the tight end thing right, too. They only kept 2, Dallas Goedert and Grant Calcaterra. It just nobody was worth keeping. But I will say, there's a couple tight ends out there, Gino, that could be of interest. Irv Smith Jr., a former second-round pick, was released today by Kansas City. I'm interested in potentially Donald Parham Jr. from the Chargers. Had 4 touchdowns last year, at least 3 in 3 of his 4 seasons in L.A. There are some options at tight end, too. Jack Stoll got released. I'm not trying to go back in time to do that, but there's 3 names they might be interested in.
The Parham one is interesting, especially because of the Kellen Moore element. Is that somebody who had success last season for Kellen Moore that could come in and potentially give you something more than E.J. Jenkins, who had some bright spots for you, but most likely is going to be that practice squad tight end for you. Albert O also is going to be headed to the injured reserve as well.
I don't believe Albert O is a real person. I don't believe he exists.
We've only seen him actually dressed for, I believe, 1 game in his entirety since that trade. And I want to touch on the Jack Stoll thing really quick. I see this every time an ex-Eagle gets released.
Eagles fans love reunions. I'm a sucker for one too, but not this one.
I get it, folks. Go watch the other 31 teams. Like, the Eagles are great. Like, I love them, but there's a lot of good football players out there. And if Jack Stoll, no offense to him, The best he could do last year when Dallas Goedert was injured was go 2 for 20. That's not a guy that you want to bring back to Philadelphia. You want to upgrade at that position. You need to justifiably add somebody to that room. It can't just be for the sake of adding somebody. Like Howie Roseman did a great job, not just saying we're going to keep 3 tight ends because that's what we have done in the past. If they don't warrant making the team, heck, Albert O was a draft pick. He's going to the Phantom IR. He probably more than likely would have been cut if he didn't sustain an injury. The guys that you're going to add potentially tomorrow, Lou, and anybody moving forward, this roster is really deep. So these players have to be good football players that are either going to, 1, challenge for playing time, or 2, give you a reliability element when it comes to keeping them on the football field. Because especially at tight end, you have 2 guys that have had injury history. You want to go out there and let's say you find a tight end who's played all 16 games or 17 games over his first 2 years in the league. Maybe you add that type of player. And hey, Jack Stoll was pretty good at least being on the football field for the team.
Yeah, I mean, at least he was out there. He didn't do much when he was on the field, but at least he was available. I think that's probably the main spot if Howie's going to add somebody. I like that you mentioned center earlier in segment 1. Like, that's something that could be possible because you don't have a traditional center backup right now. Maybe a wide receiver 6. There's a lot of notable names that are available now in the open market, but I would say tight end is definitely most likely. But again, it could be on the offensive line. Gino, again, they kept 9. So it's, of course, your starters, Mailata, Dickerson, Juergens. You've got Becton and Lane Johnson. Your main backups are Fred Johnson, Tyler Steen. Darian Kennard did earn a spot, which I agree with. And then Trevor Keegan, your day 3 pick from Michigan, who had a great summer. So I'm not really surprised anything on the line. I'm happy with that depth. It's just really like what's the plan at center if something happens to Juergens? Are they banking on Jason Kelce coming back? Like maybe that's what it is. I don't know.
Ooh, that might be like the
is
back
that it?
pocket.
Did I just nail it? Is that what it is? I mean,
fingers crossed something like that doesn't happen. But Lou, if you look at that offensive line, that's probably one of the older units that they have across this team. Because if you look at the defensive line,
which is crazy, how
many vets do they have there? Next to nobody outside of BG.
So, Gino, Jimmy Kempsky just tweeted this out. The Eagles' average age of the roster right now.
In there, bud.
It's 25.6 years old. That's the youngest roster the Eagles have had in quite some time. So the average is it's just a little over 25 years old.
And that's the way that they had to go. And especially with the investments that you have made up top, right? Those guys are young. A.J. Brown is young. Devontae Smith is young. Instead of going the route, Lou, where they're like, hey, let's just bring in some veterans that we know can give us a floor. Maybe they're like, let's just continue to bring in young players that can develop with this group. Like we always use the Golden State model to describe this team at times. Bring in these role players and let them develop for as many cost-controlled years as you possibly can. Because unlike a James Bradberry of the James Bradberry of the world, and let's say an Avonte Maddox, these young players, the Tristan McCollums, the Thomas Bookers, even a Patrick Johnson, like, what can you still give this football team? Like, where can you still continue to go? Like Eli Ricks, he can still continue to grow and be a player within this defense. And you're only going to get better playing around players like Quinyon Mitchell and Keely Ringo and Isaiah Rodgers, a young group that they probably all mesh well personality-wise. They probably all are just buddies on and off the field. It's a different day and age in Philly, man. That old core is gone, and once BG is out the door and Lane is out the door, it's a completely new team.
New era.
Youth is the movement here in Philly right now.
Speaking of Quinyon Mitchell, 27 is available now. Just saying, let's get rid of that 3-0. I need him to not be number 30, especially when he starts. If you're going to play in the slot to start, fine. You can be number 30. But Zach McPherson was released, so 27 is available. That's what he wore at Toledo. I definitely need that for sure. But yeah, on defense, there was some tough calls. We kept saying on the show, there might be a decision where you can keep 1 or 2 of 3 players. It was Patrick Johnson on the edge. Like, do you keep that number 6 edge rusher? Do you keep that number 6 defensive tackle in Thomas Booker, that 5th inside linebacker in Ben Van Sumeren? They've all made the team. Now, if they do add a pass catcher or a center when Sidney Brown does come back, do one of those guys, are they the odd man out? I would actually say probably not. I think it would be, once Brown's back if they do add a pass catcher or another offensive lineman, I think you'll see Howie try to recoup some sort of draft capital by trading an Eli Ricks or a James Bradberry, or heck, even Avonte Maddox, whose trade value right now will never be higher because of a great summer at a new position, and he has that versatility. So I think between those three guys, maybe that's the move, and Booker, Van Sumeren, and Patrick Johnson are safe, but we'll see.
I think the approach that you have to take with Avonte Maddox is one that we've kind of seen, and I think they might take this with Paris Campbell as well, who he was somebody that is maybe one of the surprise cuts for this football team.
Comparatively speaking, sure.
I think they looked around the NFL and said, okay, there's some wide receivers that might be better than a Paris Campbell right now. Like if you look at Noah Brown, I'm taking him over.
I'm surprised he got cut.
Yeah, him and Terrace Marshall too.
When I didn't think Dotson was a possibility, Brown was like my favorite trade candidate.
Yeah, a lot of the guys we mentioned to be trade potentially
were just released.
Yeah, or were just kicked off their teams, and you might be able to go and get them for free right now. But all in all, I think this roster is relatively close to being set. The biggest question will come once a player like Sidney Brown comes off of the PUP. Same with a guy like Albert O. Like, are they just going to release him when he comes back, or is that their plan at tight end to just continue to sign somebody off of the practice squad and elevate until Albert O gets back? But that's one area you have to look at. But the big three on defense, Lou, it felt like every week we're like, okay, Ben Van Sumeren probably is the only one. And then we're like, okay, maybe you can get Ben Van Sumeren and Patrick Johnson. And then we're like, oh, you need to get Ben Van Sumeren, Patrick Johnson, Tristan McCullum, and Thomas Booker onto this roster one way or another. That's how you make a football team, folks. If you want to see, and throw Darian Kennard in there as well, Lou, like if you're a fringe guy who has been cut, been around the NFL from team to team, have a summer like those five guys, man. And that's how you make a loaded roster like the Eagles. They weren't on our radar, a lot of them, coming into this summer. And look at the roles that they have earned because of the play that they put out there. And that tape does not lie. Look at the 3 games and look at the guys who made the football team. It makes all the sense in the world.
We'll continue to recap the initial 53-man Philadelphia Eagles roster for 2024 coming up next. All right, Gino, so we're breaking down the Eagles' initial 53-man roster, and we did most of the offense, a lot of the defense. So, again, 6 edge rushers were kept: Brandon Graham, Bryce Huff, of course, Nolan Smith, who I'm going to be watching closely. We'll see what he does the first half of the year because Jalix Hunt is coming, and I was very happy with his summer. He's your 4th or 5th guy. Brandon Graham as well. Patrick Johnson did make the initial team. 6 defensive linemen as well on the interior. Not surprising. Vic Fangio said he wanted at least 6 to 7 guys with their hand in the dirt. Thomas Booker was that last guy behind, of course, Carter, of course, Davis, Milton Williams, Tui Pelotu, and Ajoma. And then linebacker, Van Sumeren was that 5th guy behind, of course, Jeremiah Trotter Jr., Nakobe Dean, Zach Bond, and Devin White in no order. So I don't think any surprises. I'm just kind of surprised they were able to keep all 3 of those fringe bubble players that we really liked.
I got a question for you, Lou.
Yeah.
Let's take a step back. It's March, right? Or no, let's say after the draft. What position today do you feel more comfortable with than you did, let's say, 6 months ago?
Ooh, there's actually 2. I was going to say linebacker at first because Nakobe Dean, those final 2 weeks really let me feel a lot more comfortable. Like it looked bad. It was looking bleak, and he crushed it. He might have been their best inside linebacker of the final 2 weeks of camp in the preseason. And Jeremiah Trotter Jr. made plays all summer. And Zach Bond looked more comfortable in a spot that I didn't think he belonged in more than I thought he would look. Devin White, of course, somebody I think is going to have a bounce-back year. I'd say linebacker. BVS, too, was great, especially this past game on Saturday. But I would actually say it's defensive tackle. Like, I thought they were going to have to bring in a veteran. They are so young there, and as much as I like Tui Pelotu and Ajoma, I was wondering, like, are they really reliable to be your 4th, 5th guy, especially if Jordan Davis doesn't take that step as a pass rusher? Are we comfortable with that youth and a Thomas Booker? But I actually think they're totally fine right now. I would totally keep it with the 6 they have.
That, for me, was the one thing. Like, how is this unit going to fare without Fletcher Cox?
So I'd say just like in the spine of the defense, like DT and LB.
this is the first year, Lou, you don't have that veteran presence who has been there for 10 years that
Not at all.
no matter what, he's going to be on the field.
Who's your longest tenured veteran? Is it Milton?
Yeah, Milton Williams is your longest tenured guy on that defensive line.
And this is year 4?
It's great, though, because they showed explosiveness. They showed versatility. They all warranted playing time. Moro Ijoma showed his explosiveness. If you look at Marlon Tuipulotu, his ability to anchor and really be that next guy up behind Jordan is huge. And then Thomas Booker, you can probably play him all along the defensive line. I look at that position, linebacker, where you had some veterans in the past that left town and the position wasn't as stable. Linebacker, that's exactly what the case was last year. I was looking at the defensive line and saying, your interior, could it go the route of linebacker? And you just let the young guys play. You let the talent show out. Yes, it still is the preseason. We have to get to the regular season. But if we take a step back 6 months ago, Lou, I was petrified of who's going to step up on the inside behind Jalen Carter and Milton Williams. Looks like all of them are getting back into the groove. Jordan Davis is cutting weight. Marlon Tuipulotu is healthy and better. You look at Moro Ijoma, he's stepping up. And now Thomas Booker. That's 6 legitimate interior defensive linemen with good linebackers who play physically downhill, where you didn't have to bring in Miles Jack and Zach Cunningham late in the season. We were waiting for that move to happen. We were waiting for the veteran addition to happen on the defensive line. And this team feels comfortable enough to go into this season with the moves that they made that are young. You got to feel good about the coaching staff, developing personnel staff, bringing in the players that they can develop within the scheme. It's a good team, Lou. I'm excited to see what these guys do next Friday, but who's to say that this team is done? Because a trade could happen at quite literally any moment with this guy, Howie Roseman. He's a sicko.
Yeah, and look, they really needed depth last year in the defensive backfield. They were bleeding, right? And they could not find slot corners. Everybody was playing out of position. Sidney Brown, Eli Ricks. I mean, at one point, Mario Goodrich is out there, and Bradley Roby for a little bit. It was brutal. And these 11, like, it looks good. Although I don't want Bradberry on this team, it's nice to have 11 defensive backs that all have some sort of versatility. Sidney Brown will be back too, so there's a 12th guy. I would say, Gino, if there are moves to come, and like you said, there probably will be, if they're going to add somebody, I think it's going to be on offense, either a tight end, center, or a receiver. If they're getting rid of somebody, I do think they're going to try to get a pick for an Eli Ricks, a James Bradberry, or maybe try to capitalize on the great summer from Avonte Maddox. So I think that would be my final prediction for if this roster is not set in stone like it is right now in a few days. That's at least where I think the changes would happen.
Congratulations to the 53 that initially made it, but it is going to be a hang on by the skin of your teeth 24 hours for a lot of these guys still. So there's still opportunities to add talent, and there's still opportunities for the Eagles to get better. But if you look top to bottom, Lou, there's not many questions when you look at this team all in all. And you got to feel good about the depth.
And again, it's a very young team. Their average age is 25 years old, pretty much 25.6 to be exact. On the field, in a week or two, in a month, we might be saying something completely different.
Yeah.
But yeah, Gino, I don't have any questions right now when it comes to who's on this roster. They all earned it, and it's time to give a lot of these young guys a shot to be the new guys.
It doesn't just come from one off season of getting better. That was a whole paradigm shift years ago.
Yeah, this is 3-4 years in the making.
And this is really starting to be the culmination of it, Lou. But this is the fork in the road that the Eagles usually get to. When the expectations are there, we're either going to go one way or another. We're either going to challenge for a Super Bowl year after year after year, or we are going to have one of the worst seasons in history, and we are going to have to start this thing all over. But the expectation is we are going to compete for Super Bowl after Super Bowl after Super Bowl, and it starts with the youth movement that happened years ago. It started with the drafting of Jalen Hurts, with the addition of Devontae Smith, and going and getting A.J. Brown, and understanding, the personal side, the BGs, the Fletcher Cox, the Jason Kelsey, those stories are great, but football, age catches up to everybody.
It's a young man's game, as they say, Gino. It's a young man's game. And the Eagles, they've got the youth on both sides of the ball. We'll continue to cover this roster all week long. Got shows for you Wednesday through Friday. I'm sure Howie's going to give us something to talk about.
Yeah, practice squad's coming together tomorrow,
exactly.
So we got more roster stuff to speak of.
So make sure Locked On Eagles is your first listen each and every day. Make sure your second listen is the Locked On Fantasy Football Podcast. Get ready for your drafts all month long. Until tomorrow, though, for Gino Camilleri, I'm Lou DiBiase signing off. Thanks for downloading, watching, and listening. And let's go, Birds.
Fly, Eagles, fly.